Good morning, Sir John.
Morning. Good morning.
Now, in a moment or two, I'm going to ask Mary to invite you to take the oath. But before I do that, let me just explain to you what the setup is. You're talking not just to the room in front of you and around you, in which there are over 150 people, but in particular beyond this room, you will be talking through the mediums of live stream and YouTube to an audience out there, which I suspect today will number in the hundreds. So that's your audience, and those people to whom you are talking. Miss Richards will ask you the questions in a moment or two, but first, as I say, Mary, would you please administer the oath? You may sit or stand as you please.
Please take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Sir John, I'm just going to start with a brief overview of your political career. You first became an MP in 1979, is that correct?
That's correct.
And then your first ministerial post was at the Department of Health and Social Security. You were Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State from September 1985 to September 1986, and then Minister of State from September 1986 to June 1987.
Correct.
Now, is it right to understand that in both those roles, Parliamentary Under-Secretary and Minister of State, you were concerned with the social security rather than the health side of the department?
That's correct. The department was divided. Eventually it was split, of course. But at the time there was one department, but there were two quite distinct areas, health and social security on one side and health on the other. And I was exclusively, both as the Parliamentary Secretary and the Minister of State for the Disabled, I was on the social security side. So I saw no health documents at all at that time.
We've heard from other witnesses that there would be weekly meetings with the Secretary of State, who I think at that time was Norman Fowler. Did those involve both the health ministers and the social security ministers?
Yes, they did.
And do you have any recollection of those meetings discussing either HIV or the position of those who had been infected through blood or blood products?
Well, I dare say they must have done, but I've no recollection of them 30-odd years later.
Your ministerial career then moved to the Treasury. Between June 1987 and July 1989, you were Chief Secretary to the Treasury.
I was.
You were then Foreign Secretary for a pretty short period of time, July 89 to October 89. Why was that so short-lived?
Well, it was rather short-lived because Mr. Lawson fell out with Mrs. Thatcher and resigned, and the Prime Minister needed a new Chancellor. So to my regret, I was moved very rapidly from the Foreign Office to the Treasury.
And so you were Chancellor of the Exchequer from October 1989 to the 28th of November 1990, and then you became Prime Minister November 1990, a position you remained in until May 1997.
That is correct.
And you continued to be an MP until the May 2001 elections, is that right?
I did.
Now, just so that those listening can understand the structure of your evidence, I'm going to ask you, first of all, some general questions about decision-making in relation to government expenditure and your role at both as Chief Secretary to the Treasury and Chancellor. And I'm then going to ask you about the decision-making in which you had some involvement in terms of the provision of financial assistance or support, or decisions not to provide financial assistance and support. First of all, as Chief Secretary, then as Chancellor, and then as Prime Minister, and then I'll have some general questions towards the end. So starting, if we may, with your role and responsibilities as Chief Secretary to the Treasury, what in broad terms is the nature of that job, and how does it differ from the job of the Chancellor of the Exchequer?
Well, the Chancellor of the Exchequer has responsibility for the overall control of the Treasury. He's responsible for macro policy. And in that time, that would have included the responsibilities the Bank of England now have of setting interest rates. But within that, the Chief Secretary, who's also a junior member of Cabinet, but subordinate to the Chancellor, of course, the Chief Secretary is responsible for the conduct of public expenditure. And what that means is that every autumn there would be a public expenditure round, and each Department of State would individually submit their bids, their wish list, for expenditure in the following year. And the Chief Secretary would have to negotiate what their expenditure actually was. There would be individual negotiations with each and every Secretary of State on their own individual expenditure bids. How that would work within the Treasury was at first, once the bids were submitted, the Treasury would look at them and brief the Chief Secretary. The Chief Secretary would then meet alone with the Secretary of State for Health or Education or Defence, whatever it may be, and would negotiate exactly what happened. And although the Chief Secretary is the junior member of Cabinet, or was in the pecking order in those days, he did have an extraordinary amount of influence because he was able to move expenditure about in those negotiations. And he was able to determine within budgets which were the areas of particular importance. Now, he didn't make that up. He had to pick that up from the bids that were actually submitted by the civil service and the minister in those particular departments. But it was a long and arduous business, negotiating public expenditure. I'm not sure it's done the same way today, but that's how it was done then. And of course, from time to time, there would be disputes. The department might bid more than the Chief Secretary felt was appropriate. And where there were disputes, the meeting would probably, or meetings, plural, would probably break up and they would reassemble. If it was completely impossible to reach a conclusion, a satisfactory conclusion to both the Chief Secretary and the Spending Minister, then the matter would be referred to a Cabinet subcommittee, loosely called the Star Chamber, which would be chaired by a very senior member of Cabinet. In those days, it was chaired by William Whitelaw, who was the Deputy Prime Minister effectively in those days. And they would determine whether to agree with the Chief Secretary or with the Spending Minister or strike a compromise, and that would be a settled part of public expenditure. And the Chief Secretary worked within a remit. The Chancellor and the Cabinet would have agreed a total of overall expenditure that was appropriate for the macroeconomy, the amount we could afford without dramatically changing taxation. And so he didn't have a completely free hand. He had to bring in the public expenditure round within the limits of expenditure set by the Chancellor and approved by the Cabinet. So that is the basis of how it worked. It was a very long and arduous business, and often led to some disputes, but mostly, not invariably, they were settled without reference to the Cabinet Subcommittee.
I'm just going to ask you to look at a passage from your autobiography which describes this process. Lawrence, it's RLIT 0001628, and it should be the third page. So we can pick it up at the top of the page. You say the Chief Secretary, this is the third line, has one of the lowest profiles of any Cabinet Minister, but this is deceptive. For he is the most influential minister in determining the division of the total of public spending, who gets what. This gives him the power, if he wishes, to facilitate new policies or to hold them back. Thus, although the most junior member of the Cabinet, the Chief Secretary has an authority far greater than the casual observer ever realises. And then if we skip over the next paragraph, please, Lawrence, and go down just over halfway down the page. The most important part of the Chief Secretary's year is the Public Expenditure Survey, which begins in the summer when each Secretary of State puts in a bid for his department's financing for the next 3 years. Is this the process you were just describing, Sir John?
Exactly so.
These bids set out the ambitions of the department for the years ahead. Rather as the Black Widow spider dances an odd quadrille with its partner before finally mating, the public spending round has its own rituals. The bids often contain an unrealistic wish list and are invariably padded so that the minister can be seen to make concessions in head-to-head negotiation with the Treasury. Now, that might suggest that as Chief Secretary, you would potentially approach the bid with a degree of scepticism. Is that right?
I'm not sure I'd use the word scepticism, but any spending minister will put in bids larger than he expects to be approved, because he knows in negotiations if he makes concessions in some area, he's more likely to get exactly what he wishes in another area. And also, you would find typically, let's assume the Cabinet had set a remit of X for the sum total of all the public expenditure. Routinely, when the bids were submitted, they would come to X plus a very great deal. They might even come to 2X. And so there was a huge amount to be taken out of the public expenditure bids in order to meet the demands of what the economy can afford without rapidly rising taxation or rapidly increasing borrowing. And of course, in that particular period, in the 80s and the 90s, of course, we were in a period of great economic difficulty. We were facing high levels of unemployment. We were facing very high levels of inflation. And it was necessary to deal with those. The problem manifested itself a little more seriously a little later than 87. In 89 and 90, it was a much more serious position. But even then, there was a real concern with inflation. It had been a bugbear for governments since the 1960s. And whatever successive governments, Conservative, Labour, whatever they had been, had tried to do, it had been devilishly difficult to get inflation down and keep it down. And government after government had failed actually to do so. And so inflation was the big bugbear that had affected expenditure right the way through 30, 40 or so years. And it wasn't until the 90s and the sheer pain of policies in the 90s, including the exchange rate mechanism, that actually got inflation down to a low period, where it stayed subsequently for about 30 years.
Does that mean that, given the economic background you describe and the role of the Chief Secretary, that the Chief Secretary would be a kind of inverted Mr. McCorber, always looking for something to turn down, effectively?
Well, Mr. McCorber was always waiting for something to turn up.
Precisely.
But not really. The job of the Chief Secretary is not to be an abominable no-man. That is emphatically not his role. It's not only an economic role, it's a political role. And the Chief Secretary would have to be political. He has to reduce bids that are not of prime concern. He has to do that in order to make sure you can fund the things that really are important. So he's not an abominable no-man. But where he sees a bid that plainly is unnecessary or prevents money being provided for something that is more necessary, he's likely to say no to it. But when he finds something that is desirable, it is usually the case that he will accept the bid. Now, he may not accept the entirety of the bid, because the other element of this is to make sure that the money can actually be spent within the financial year. In those days, the public expenditure round covered 1 year only, effectively. The principal bit was 1 year only. And so the Chief Secretary would wish to ensure that the bids weren't padded to go into a second year, because if that happens in the Department of Education, then you're having to cut down in the Department of Social Security. So there is a good deal more sub-complexities in the public expenditure round than I immediately explained, or that I set out in the extract from my biography.
And how does the Chief Secretary then decide what is more important, what does merit funding and what does not?
Precedent, necessity, changing circumstances. He'll sometimes take account of something he knows is coming down the road that will occur in the middle of the year but hasn't yet occurred. And of course, because it's impossible to forecast all these things, the Chief Secretary and the Treasury would set a contingency fund as well. The contingency fund is more an art form than a science. You gather together what you think might happen that is unexpected and unforeseen, and what it might cost. And it's very much an assessment. There's no scientific process in that, but it does give you a contingency fund so that if something occurs in mid-year that could not have been foreseen or is more expensive than was foreseen, there is a contingency fund to which the department can turn approach the Chief Secretary and ask for more money.
And is the contingency fund a general one, or are there specific contingencies for different
it's a general
departments?
contingency fund. Let us suppose you were the Secretary of State for Health, and in the middle of the year, a new health crisis arose that you hadn't foreseen and nobody else had foreseen. If that involved expenditure, you would come to the Chief Secretary, let us assume it was me, and ask for more money. the first thing I would do would be to look at your budgets and see if you were underspending in some of the areas we had agreed at the previous expenditure round, to see whether there was a bulk of money in your budget that could be moved to meet that contingency. And if there wasn't, and more often there isn't than there is, if there wasn't, I would then discuss with you the size of contingency funding you needed. And I would agree that, and that would be the end of the matter. You would have the money.
So in terms of the annual bids, you've described a process that if there was disagreement, it could go to this star chamber, yes, this cabinet or ministerial subcommittee. What about the contingency reserve?
Typically, if there was a disagreement, they could either go to the Deputy Prime Minister, William Whitelaw, who would probably reassemble the committee, or you could appeal directly to the Prime Minister. You could do either.
And if we
the principal point, I'm sure you'll come to this later, but one of the principal jobs of the Prime Minister is actually to determine and settle disagreements between ministers upon expenditure or policy matters.
And so the process you've described, is this right? You wouldn't expect it to go to the Prime Minister unless there was a disagreement that couldn't otherwise be resolved?
No. If there wasn't a disagreement, the Chief Secretary would agree it. And I cannot think of a single occasion in which I agreed a contingency expenditure when it didn't go through without any difficulty at all. I mean, the Chancellor might look at it and raise an eyebrow, but I can't think of a single time when anybody objected to a contingency agreement that had been made.
And typically, how much information would a department supply to the Treasury? I'm talking now about the general process, not the contingency applications or requests. How much information would it supply to the Treasury for the Chief Secretary to take his or her decision?
Oh, they'd supply a certain amount of information. Here is the problem, they would say, this is how we think it will work out, this is the money we think is going to be necessary. The Chief Secretary would then ask questions. He would probably ask, I mean, this doesn't happen for every tiny bit, of course, or you'd be doing it all year. But for the significant areas, the Chief Secretary may well ask further questions. And when you come to talk to me, ask me later about some of the issues that arise, you will see that exactly that thing happened. I paused on the expenditure because I needed to ask a number of questions that had not yet been answered by the department. But in the end, they got their money, but they did have to provide the information that was necessary to ensure it was value for money. The point about the Chief Secretary really is that he is the barrier between a total loss of control over expenditure and the taxpayer having to pay for it. Because it isn't the government's money. That is what people tend often to forget. It is the taxpayer's money. It is the money of everybody in this room and everybody, as Sir Brian said, who may be watching this morning. It is their taxes, and the Chief Secretary is their defence against unlimited expenditure.
Whilst we have this document on screen, could we go to 2 pages further on, please, Lawrence? Just want to pick it up towards the bottom of the page. Just the last 2 paragraphs. So you say in the penultimate paragraph, I tried to reduce or eliminate bids by challenging the case made for them by the ministers facing me, although in doing so I was always acutely aware that they had to return to their departments and defend the deal they had accepted. I always left them with what we in the Treasury called a lollipop, even if we denied many of their cherished schemes. I had no wish to undermine their credibility or that of the government. Just pausing there, what did you mean there by leaving them with a lollipop?
In almost every bid, there's something which, if you were utterly rigorous, you would have been able to toss out. But the credibility of ministers in their department is important. It's important to the conduct of government generally, and it's important to them within their ministry. So occasionally you would see things that you could, if you wished to be utterly ruthless, have torn out of their expenditure bid. And I chose not to do so. They weren't things that involved hundreds of millions of pounds. They would have been relatively small things. But I was conscious that the spending ministers had a responsibility to their departments and to their clients. And as I said, I didn't see the role of Chief Secretary to be an abominable no-man. You sometimes have to accept the advice you're given. So sometimes I was a little more lenient in some areas where I could perhaps, if I wished, have been tougher. But I'll enter this caveat. That it did depend that I could see I was on track for getting the sum total of public expenditure within the ceiling set by the Cabinet.
To what extent would departments effectively be bidding against each other or trade-offs?
Oh, absolutely they are. They're absolutely bidding against each other. They don't see it that way. I mean, each individual department would look at what that department felt it needed. Now, every department would have had ambitions that would have been too expensive for the taxpayer to meet. So those ambitions had to be delayed or pared back. So in essence, to take the example I gave earlier, if the sum total of public expenditure be permitted by the government that the country could afford was X, and the bids were 2X, then you had to pare things down. And that was the job of the Chief Secretary. So every department was, in a sense, in competition with other departments. It may be that one department, well, for example, if you take the recent COVID outbreak, plainly the Department of Health needed more help than other departments. So within an overall ceiling, two things could have happened. The contingency fund could have met every addition, or alternatively, if other departments were underspending, or if there was no capacity for the contingency fund to meet it, you could have pared down the budgets of other departments.
During the time when you were Chief Secretary, did ministers come to you in very different ways? Were there some who would really fight their corner and try and get as much as possible, and others who would be much more relaxed?
Well, I don't think any of them were very relaxed. Going to the Treasury with an expenditure bid is quite a business. And the Treasury would have been very well briefed, and they would have made sure that I was very well briefed. So it wasn't easy. There were some ministers who were better at it than others. The territorial ministers were always extremely tough, because a large part of their expenditure was just automatically reflected from the percentage expenditure that is made for that department in England. But other things were not. And they fiercely fought for those, largely because they were relatively small amounts. And also because they knew at the end of the day, when you closed the public expenditure round, you weren't going to hold it up for the odd million or so, and they knew it. And so they were much less likely to concede during discussion. The two most difficult ministers to negotiate with throughout the years I was Chief Secretary were territorial secretaries of state.
And then I just wanted to pick up what you say in your, again in your autobiography about John Moore, Secretary of State for Health and Social Security at that time. So it's the bottom of the page. You say, one tale needs scotching. John Moore, who after the election had become Secretary of State for Health and Social Security, and I were said to be rivals, and it was widely believed in some quarters that I gave him a poor settlement in order to damage his political career. John was a former, we go over the page, Treasury Minister convinced of the virtues of low spending, and rather quixotically he tried to match his policies to his philosophy. In pursuit of this admirable consistency, he bid for too little money in the public expenditure settlement rather than too much. This concern for prudent economics would cause him much difficulty, a rare and honest approach that earned him opprobrium. Could you just flesh that out a little in the sense of your reflection that he would bid for too little and that would cause him difficulty?
John had been a Treasury Minister. He was steeped in Treasury orthodoxy. He knew how important it was to keep the total of public expenditure within the limits that the country could afford, or we would be borrowing more and interest rates might rise, or we would have to raise taxes. And he was acutely concerned about that. And he looked beyond his own department and felt himself instinctively that every department ought to assist the Treasury in making sure you could keep within the public expenditure levels agreed by the Cabinet. He was quite rare among Cabinet Ministers in taking that view. Most of them had looked at their department and their direct responsibilities and bid for the money. to see whether or not they could get it. That, I think, is basic human nature, and most of them did that. John Moore didn't, in that he differed from the other colleagues. And so his bids were sometimes on the low side. And indeed, there were occasions in the discussions with John Moore when we agreed to move his bids around a bit, so that in some areas he got a little more than he had initially asked for.
And when you say that caused him much difficulty, was that because it resulted in an underfunded department?
Well, it was difficulty. It resulted in difficulty for him because there were things he could have bid to do, but didn't bid to do. And when they popped up a little later, people said, well, why didn't the Secretary of State foresee this? Why didn't he bid for it? And of course, at the end of the day, not in a single year, but over a period of years, you're only in a position to meet really dire contingencies if your financial accounts are in good order. John Moore took that long-term view rather than the short-term view that he must just see his department through the next 12 months.
Can I then turn to your time as Chief Secretary and some of the decisions in which you had a degree of involvement? I'm going to start with a letter, September 1987. It's SCGV 607_050, please, Lawrence. We can see it's addressed to the Prime Minister. It's headed Compensation for Haemophiliacs. And at the top, there is a letter stamp which reads Secretary of State for Social Services. If we go to the next page, bottom of the page, we can see it's dated the 24th of September 1987. The signature's been redacted, but the initials are JM. Is that JM you?
No.
Is it your understanding that that JM is John Moore?
It is John. He was the Secretary of State for Social Services. It was interpreted as being me in a widely read tabloid who produced several pages, some years later, of how I had personally tried to persuade the Prime Minister not to be helpful on the subject of people suffering from blood infection. But it emphatically was not my letter.
If we then just look at the content of it, because it was copied to you, and it really helps us, I think, pick up the decision-making process. So the first paragraph explains, I'm writing to let you know how I intend to handle the issue of compensation for haemophiliacs with the HIV virus and the media campaign which will be launched shortly on their behalf by the Haemophilia Society of Great Britain. The next paragraph then explains in the first line that the campaign will be emotive and highly charged. We will be under considerable parliamentary and public pressure after the press launch of the campaign in early October, and no doubt the issue will be active during our party conference. There's then a description of the background in the next paragraph. If we go to the bottom of the page, Mr. Moore says, the question of government compensation for this group was raised specifically when Norman Fowler and Tony Newton gave evidence earlier this year to the Social Services Select Committee. Whilst Norman and Tony made it quite clear how much they sympathised, the government's position was that there has never been a general state scheme to compensate those who suffer adverse effects from medical treatment. Compensation can only be awarded by the courts if negligence is proved. The full range of social security benefits are, of course, available to those haemophiliacs who qualify. And then he says this, I've looked at the case for compensation again carefully in the light of the impending campaign, but have concluded that the line taken with the Social Services Committee was right. Any special arrangements for compensation could cost a minimum of £3 million and could only be funded at the expense of other priorities. Moreover, it's logically difficult to distinguish the claim by haemophiliacs from the claim of many others damaged in the course of their medical treatment, and there's no doubt that compensating haemophiliacs would lead to pressure from many other groups for similar treatment. And then he continues, while all of us must have every sympathy for haemophiliacs who've been infected with the HIV virus, I do not feel it would be wise to set a general precedent by accepting that the government should provide a special compensation scheme. I shall be taking steps to ensure that the case for not giving compensation is well understood by the media and by our own supporters. I am, of course, very ready to discuss this issue with you if you so wish. And then he explains he's copying this minute to the Lord President, Secretaries of State for Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland, the Chief Secretary, and to Sir Robert Armstrong. So the Chief Secretary at that point in time is you.
It was.
Now, this wasn't a document that called for any particular action or decision by the Prime Minister or indeed by you as Chief Secretary. Do you, as far as you can recall, was this the first time the question of compensation had been raised or brought to your attention?
Well, so far as I'm aware, yes. I see nothing on the letter when I saw the original letter that indicated whether I saw it or not. I may well have done. I may well have seen it, but there are a lot of letters that are copied to different departments because at some stage they may have to take a role. And so the earlier correspondence is copied to them, seen by the principal private secretary, but held for a future date in case they are going to be needed by that department. So I certainly didn't take any action on that. I suspect, probably given its content, that I did see it. I suspect that I did see it. And it soon became apparent that that line of no compensation, no fault compensation, to use the jargon, was one that was going to be perfectly easy to hold in legal terms, but not at all easy to hold in moral terms. And that is why, as we will see, there was subsequently more discussion, more help, as the scale of the disaster became apparent.
And we'll pick that up as we go through the documents. Just to, for the sake of completeness, Lawrence, if we have DHSC 0004541_141, we have a letter from number 10, dated the 28th of September 1987, which records that the Prime Minister, who was, of course, at that time Mrs. Thatcher, has seen and noted without comment your Secretary of State's minute of the 24th of September. And then we can see that the letter in turn was copied to the same recipients of the first letter. Now, that's September 87. I want to pick it up then in the next month with a letter you received, I think along with many other MPs, from the Hemophilia Society. It's at HSOC 0004760_001. So this is a letter, 12th of October 1987. It's from the Reverend Tanner, who was chairman of the Hemophilia Society. This is a blank version in the sense it's dear blank, but we'll see from subsequent letters that you were one of the recipients of it. And he says, I'm writing to ask for your support in our campaign to help the most tragic victims of the AIDS crisis, people with haemophilia. The second paragraph then describes, picking it up in the second line, a large number of people were infected as a result of treatment by commercially produced products, mainly drawn from blood donations given in the US and Third World. Treatment from this source with the attendant risks was required because the UK was not and still is not self-sufficient in blood products despite of successive government promises since 1977. The letter then goes on to talk about the effects on those who've been infected. We can see those listed. I don't propose to read them out. The Reverend Tanner explains 57 have AIDS, 41 have died. All of this in addition to having to cope with a life-threatening disorder, haemophilia. The government is responsible for this situation. All these people were infected as a result of treatment through the NHS. And then he adds, despite the House of Commons Social Services Committee accepting that, calls for compensation for haemophiliacs and others who become HIV positive as a consequence of infected blood transfusion and for special life insurance arrangements for haemophiliacs deserve careful consideration, the government has not as yet volunteered any form of support, financial or otherwise. At present, they are hiding behind the cloak of the courts in saying that they are not liable for compensation. However, there is a clear moral case that the government should provide recompense. And then he sets out further details in that regard. Now, we can see, I think, that you undoubtedly received that letter from HSOC.
Yes, I did.
0003584. This is you writing, is this correct, in your capacity as MP rather than as Chief Secretary to the Treasury?
Yes, it is, and I'll explain why that was. The letter was sent to my constituency as a constituency Member of Parliament. I suspect it was probably sent to a lot of Members of Parliament. Members of Parliament get a great deal of letters that are circular. I don't know whether that was the case, but the fact that it was sent to me in my constituency rather than at the Treasury suggested it was part of a circulation of letters to many people rather than specifically to the Chief Secretary. And I replied as a constituency MP.
And we can see in the second paragraph, you say, I fully appreciate the serious nature of these, that's a reference to the problems faced by victims of haemophilia, and have noted carefully the views which you express in your letter. I will do what I can to bring these to the attention of my colleagues in the government who have special responsibility for health matters. And then you explain you're unable to attend a meeting that had been arranged at the House of Commons. What would you have had in mind when you said that you would do what you could to bring the problems to the attention of colleagues in government?
Well, two things, really. Firstly, it may help a little if I explain the correspondence process. If a Member of Parliament receives a letter from their constituent that relates to a specific problem rather than a policy matter where a reply would be straightforward, they would do one of two things. They would either see the Minister, but that's not very popular because if every Member of Parliament asked to see the Minister on every letter they had, the Ministers would do nothing else. Or he would write to the Minister either paraphrasing the concern, which was what I tended to do when I wrote, or attaching a copy of the letter and asking the Minister what the government's policy was in order that we could inform the constituent or the person who had written to you exactly what the policy was. If the policy was obnoxious or wrong, you might then see the Minister and talk to it. Now, at this distance in time, 35 years ago, I have no constituency records of my exchanges with constituents in 1987, perhaps unsurprisingly. But I assume I would have written to John Moore, probably since we were colleagues in Cabinet, I would have spoken to him most probably not in a formal meeting, but as we were in the lobbies voting. When you vote in the lobbies, you go in the aye lobby or the no lobby, whichever is appropriate. All the Members of Parliament who are in that lobby mill around. It takes quite a time to vote. It's a very old-fashioned process. And you have the opportunity of talking to your colleagues or ministers. It's highly probable, since John and I, self-evidently Chief Secretary and Health Secretary, had a lot to do with one another, that I would have discussed it with him then.
Now, if we just go over the page, the Hemophilia Society, this time Mr. Waters, the General Secretary, wrote back to you 16th of October 1987. The first paragraph, thanked you for the letter, and described the letter in these terms, in which you expressed support for the campaign which we've recently launched to secure special provision for people with haemophilia who become HIV antibody positive through materials prescribed by the NHS. I just want to ask you about something in the letter that you then wrote back to Mr. Waters. It's HSOC 0003583. So 20th of October, you say this in the second paragraph. I'm afraid I must clarify one point, and then you quote from the letter that had been sent by that had been sent by you to Mr. Tanner. And then you say this in the third paragraph. My letter was intended to show my overall appreciation of the problems of people who've become HIV antibody positive through materials prescribed by the NHS, and should not be interpreted as support for the campaign which we have recently launched. I am sure you will understand that as a government minister, I am precluded by convention from giving specific support to campaigns of this nature, although this does not, of course, preclude me from discussing them with colleagues on a confidential basis. What was the convention that precluded you from expressing positive or public support?
When you have a letter like that, you're essentially asking the government to change its policy. Ministers just don't do that and remain ministers. It's just not the way one behaves. In terms of private nature, you may lobby very hard for something, but you don't say, you don't want to get any headlines in the paper, Minister X attacks government policy on Y. So you don't say that publicly. What I actually said to him at the time was that I appreciated the serious nature of the issue, and indeed I did, because it was becoming more serious, as we shall see no doubt in a few moments. So I was very sympathetic and remained sympathetic. But until we had changed a policy, it was not appropriate for me as a minister to indicate that, and nor did I. The point about no-fault compensation was always quite a sound point in terms of precedent. What was a much less sound point was the matter I referred to a moment ago, that there are times when your instincts override what is existing policy, and then you try and change policy within government because you are sympathetic to a particular cause. Now, if I may say so, John Moore is no longer with us. And the impression would have been given by the earlier letter from John that you quoted that he was unsympathetic. I have to tell you he wasn't. He wasn't unsympathetic. He was echoing the government's effective line on the legality of the issue, whilst discussing and wondering whether something more should be done about it, as did his successors. And as Chief Secretary, of course, I was aware of what they were thinking privately, but not saying publicly. And the reason they did that, of course, is because until they have all the facts, they don't want to inspire hope that is not met or create controversy that is avoidable. So it is a circumstance, a system that governments from the dawn of time have actually operated until a change of policy is privately agreed. Now, at that time, I replied to Mr. Waters, and I remember his letter because it came so soon after the one from the Reverend Tanner. I was sympathetic of the government's position, of the position of the Hemophilia Society, and it was being discussed privately. John Moore had said at one stage there was not a good case for compensation for reasons of precedent. He did not rule out, nor did he say he'd ruled out, compensation in view of the circumstances of those who were infected. And that is why his position seemed a rather hard line, and it was a good deal less hard line, if I may speak belatedly in his defence, than it immediately seemed. And pretty soon afterwards, if I recall, Tony Newton, who I think was the Minister of State, and John Moore were due to meet the Hemophilia Society. And they had discussed that with me and with others before they went. But only in broad outline they said that they were going. There were many questions before they went that they weren't in a position to answer. And so I advised them to be cautious about those particular questions because we wished to be sure of our facts before any policy was changed.
Let's just pick up that correspondence. If we could have, please, Lawrence, DHSC 0002375_010. Now, this is an undated letter, but it's probably late October or early November, because it refers to, in the first sentence, a meeting on the 3rd of November, and this is 1987. The second paragraph picks up on John Moore's minute of the 24th of September, the one that we looked at a few minutes ago. And then the third paragraph says this, and you're absolutely right, this is from Tony Newton. Whilst John and I still consider those arguments to be intellectually valid, there is a powerful practical case for recognising the particular circumstances of the infected haemophiliacs. This is reinforced by the Society's argument that those affected are a clearly defined group whose numbers are already determined. There is also very strong support for the Society, particularly from our own supporters inside and outside the House. In view of this, we have concluded that the line we have been taking is unlikely to prove politically sustainable. And then if we just look further down, the next paragraph, Mr. Newton explains, we believe it would be counterproductive to hold to our present line when we see the Haemophilia Society on Tuesday. We therefore propose to respond more positively by saying the government understood and sympathised with the case that the society were making. We were therefore considering how best we might respond, and would talk to them again when we'd reached a decision. If you are content with this approach, and the you is the Prime Minister, John and I will discuss the options with colleagues before a further meeting with the society. Our aim will be to identify an acceptable response which runs the least risk of setting a precedent and keeps direct government involvement to a minimum. We'll also have to consider how the cost, which is likely to be the order of 5 million to 10 million, should be met. I'm copying this minute to members of HA. That, I think, is the Cabinet Subcommittee on AIDS. In any event, and you were a member of HA, so this is a letter copied to you. Now, if we could just go further up the page again a little, please, Lawrence. Entirely acknowledge, Sir John, this isn't a letter you authored, but it's a letter you saw. The reference in the third paragraph is to the powerful practical case, and then in the last sentence of that paragraph to the line being unlikely to prove politically sustainable. Looking at it now, what do you think you would have understood the reasons being put forward for a change of position to be?
Oh, I think because it was becoming apparent how serious the issue was and how widespread the issue was and how unsustainable it would be for the people who were suffering without some form of practical compensation. We still didn't know the full scale of what was going on, but it was perfectly apparent that it was a moving situation. And although it's not expressly indicated in here, I think the thought in everyone's mind is that there will be a movement now, and there may well be a movement at a later stage as further evidence becomes available. There's a rather unattractive end to that paragraph when it says it's unlikely to prove politically sustainable. This is a letter from Tony Newton. I have to say Tony Newton would have been much more concerned with the moral case than the political unsustainability of it. I don't know how many people in this room may have known Tony Newton, but he wore his heart on his sleeve, and it was a very big heart indeed. So he would have been more concerned, I think, about the moral case, but he was seeking to persuade ministerial colleagues that politics demanded there was action, as well as the moral case that existed. But this was a moving situation.
And this, of course, is addressed to the Prime Minister.
Yes.
Would that perhaps suggest a thinking or an understanding that the Prime Minister might be more swayed by the political argument than the moral argument?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I can quite see why one might think that. But this is, of course, was a letter written to the Prime Minister, but circulated to all sorts of other people as well. It was generally aimed. It wasn't a specific indication that you had a hard-hearted Prime Minister who was going to be beastly, so you had to say it was all about politics. That really wouldn't have been what was in Tony's mind.
Why? Again, I'm asking you about a letter you received but didn't write. But it's a theme we might pick up with some of the later documents as well. Politically sustainable or politically unsustainable might suggest, coupled with the reference there to there being strong support inside and outside the House from our own supporters, that this was the government beginning to yield to public pressure, political pressure, rather than being swayed by a moral case.
Yes, it does give that impression. I can see that. I can only tell you from within government. Of course, pressure from Parliament in particular is a very real part of any decision-making. That is certainly true. But I have to say to you, it wasn't the only part of the decision-making. And it is apparent from the Newton letters, anyone who knows Newton, that it wouldn't possibly have been. But certainly there was very widespread support within Parliament and within the governing party for the position of the haemophiliacs as the situation became better known. I mean, if you look at the context of the times, I said earlier there was a huge amount of economic problems. It was economic problems that were dominant in Parliament. But the position of the haemophiliacs and what had happened with blood was cutting into that. It was becoming more understood in Parliament and more known in Parliament. Now, Parliament's often like a great tanker. It takes a long time for something to turn it round. And I would certainly say in retrospect that the way opinion was building, it was beginning to turn around. But ministers aren't some different breed who are completely distracted and unaffected by the same emotions that affect backbench members of Parliament. So it wasn't that the government was just reacting to pressure. The government could see the case for help as well as the backbenchers. But it is much easier for a backbencher to bang the table and say, we must have help now, than a government that has to look at the implications of providing help. How much help should there be? What would be the cost of that help in terms of taking money away from other people? How should you direct the help so it goes into the best order? Over what period should that help exist? Should this help be in addition to the social security benefits that were already being paid? One mustn't forget that the social security benefits were already being paid to people who were suffering. But we were beginning to talk here about amounts over and above that to go to the McFarlane Trust as would become, to be distributed to people with haemophilia. So there was a good deal of sensitivity on both sides, both by the government at the time and by the House of Commons as a whole.
I'll perhaps pick up later your description of the tanker and the time taken to turn it round when we've looked at the full range of decision-making over the following years. If we then just pick up your response to Tony Newton at DHSC 0003961_011, please, Lawrence. So this is a letter from you, 2nd of November 1987, and we can see bottom of the page that your name appears at the bottom there. If we look at the second paragraph, I have to say that although in terms of equity there might seem to be some gains to be made from a positive response, it would seem to have very real dangers. How could such a precedent be ring-fenced? It could lead to an open-ended commitment of huge dimensions. Might it not give rise to court action against the government because of the implication of negligence? Have the law officers given a view on the possible consequences of a sympathetic response? I do not feel that we can afford to offer such a response until the pros and cons have been thoroughly considered. I therefore suggest that you and John Moore should listen only at this stage, and that the most you should say is that you will consider the points made by the Society with no implication that the government will take action. And then you copy the letter to the Prime Minister and the members of HA. What did you mean, or what looking at this now, do you think you meant by the reference to in terms of equity and some gains to be made?
I can tell you exactly what I meant by it. Consider the questions that were unanswered and had to be answered. You'll note I didn't say that we shouldn't offer it. I said we shouldn't offer a response until we'd thoroughly considered the pros and cons of doing it. And those pros and cons were principally how much money should it be, to whom should it go, when should it go, in what form should it go, what trapdoors would be open to present and future claims on medical issues, what were the law officers' views on the implications of offering effectively no-fault compensation, both now and in the future. Now, there was no suggestion, I think, either by them or by me, that there wasn't going to be some compensation, but we had to be aware of what we were doing if we were going to get the compensation right and how we dealt with it right. And frankly, the Department of Health should have examined that matter with the Chief Secretary before they had their meeting with the Hemophilia Society, but they hadn't done so. I think the meeting had come in a bit of a rush for one reason or another, and they hadn't done so. But before we could decide what help should be given and how the help should be given and to who the help should be given and in what form, we had to answer those particular questions. And that was the purpose of my cautionary letter to them, saying, listen now, and then when you come back, we can discuss further.
And I understand the questions that you've described and that you're posing also in the letter, but specifically the reference to in terms of equity, there might seem to be some gains to be made from a positive response. Do you know what that meant?
Well, I think we're talking about the position of the haemophiliacs there.
So the gains are not gains to the government from responding?
Well, I don't think the government gained very much of the sort of horror people were facing. I mean, there's no amount of compensation you can give that could actually compensate for what had happened to them. what had happened to them was incredibly bad luck, awful, and it was not something that anybody was unsympathetic to.
I'm going to come back, just so that those listening know, to the use of the word luck and fate, which you use in your statement, and I want to explore that with you at a little later stage of your evidence.
Yes, sure.
Just to carry through the decision-making in relation to the requests that had come from Tony Newton and John Moore, we can see then that the matter was considered by the Cabinet Subcommittee on AIDS on the 10th of November 1987. Could we have CABO 010016_011, please? This is the set of minutes of the meeting held on the 10th of November 1987, Cabinet Home and Social Affairs Committee, Subcommittee on AIDS. And we can see, if we look at those attending, it's chaired by Lord Whitelaw, and then we have a number of Secretaries of State in attendance. If we just go slightly down, we can see John Moore is there, and you were there in your capacity as Chief Secretary to the Treasury. We also have a reference there to Donald Aitchison, the Chief Medical Officer, being in attendance. If we could go, please, Lawrence, to page 6. We can see the heading Special Financial Assistance for Haemophiliacs. And then the minutes record the subcommittee considered a memorandum by the Secretary of State on whether the government should provide special financial assistance for haemophiliacs. Now, I'm not going to take you to the memorandum, but for the sake of the transcript, so that others can look at it if they wish to, it's JEVA 5021. But in fact, the minutes largely set out what it was that John Moore was saying. If we pick it up just in that paragraph beginning, the Secretary of State for Social Services said, it's about 9 lines down, Sir John, where it's recorded, he had continued the policy of his predecessor in resisting special financial assistance for haemophiliacs infected by HIV on the ground that there'd never been a general state scheme to compensate those who'd suffered adverse effects from medical treatment. However, he was now very clearly of the view that the position was not sustainable unless concessions were made. Haemophilia Society had recently launched a campaign for government compensation. This had attracted a great deal of support in Parliament and elsewhere. And the Society had been given advice by Council that it was most unlikely that liability could be proved against the government, but they'd successfully got across their contention that the moral fault lay with the government for failing to secure self-sufficiency in blood products. Whilst this was a tendentious argument, it was difficult to refute it convincingly. Now, just pausing there, Sir John, before we look at the rest of the document and the rest of the discussion, you'll recall that the letters we looked at from the Haemophilia Society, rather than simply calling for no-fault compensation, had actually made out a case of fault, not necessarily legal liability, but fault on the part of the government or the NHS for failing to secure self-sufficiency in blood products. And then we see John Moore then saying, describing that as a tendentious argument, but difficult to refute it convincingly. It's not clear, I think, from the contemporaneous documentation that certainly I've seen, what was meant by that, or what investigation had been undertaken as to the alleged failure to secure self-sufficiency. Do you recall that being a subject of concern or discussion?
Well, at 35 years distance, no, I don't, and nor would it be likely that I would do. I can think of various things he may have meant, but I don't know. It wasn't my letter, and I don't know what he did mean by that. He may have meant while it was tendentious legally, for example, since he makes the point also that the advice they'd had was that there was no legal liability. He doesn't quite put it in those terms, but that was certainly what the government were being told as to the strictly legal position. as opposed to the moral obligation that I referred to earlier.
In very broad terms, would you accept this? A moral obligation might be said to arise in two ways. That there may be plenty more that I haven't thought of, but two particular ways. One might be the suffering is so great that the government should take action. The other might be there's a moral responsibility or a moral case, because although for reasons relating to difficulties in bringing legal claims and the definition of duty of care, there might not be a legal claim, nonetheless there was fault. Things were done wrong, things were done that should not have been done. Do you...
Yes, I mean, what was in the mind of the... I mean, I can't remember this particular meeting, but certainly what was in the mind of the ministers who had discussed it with me, the health ministers, was the growing level of suffering. That was what was moving their minds. Their minds were not moving because they had suddenly been told by the lawyers, golly, the government are liable. Their minds were moving because they thought there was an obligation, a moral obligation, because of the degree of suffering. That was what was in their mind.
If we then just continue, we can see Mr. Moore continues, he believed the government should accept that haemophiliacs suffered from a unique combination of problems and that special financial assistance should accordingly be made available to them. It was most important that any scheme, if we go to the top of the next page, should be very tightly drawn so that it could not be used as a precedent for other claims. And then there is a further discussion in that regard, which I'm not going to read out. But we can pick it up about 10, 11 lines down. We see the proposal. He proposed that up to £10 million should be made available to the Hemophilia Society for distribution to cases of need. And then, if we look at the bottom of the page, thank you. So this is in relation to the issue of funding. His centrally funded services programme for the current financial year had already come under extraordinary pressure. The proposed financial assistance could only be met out of his, could be met out of his budget only by making cuts of around 10% in non-demand-led services. Such reductions in politically very sensitive areas would attract great criticism and would detract from the credit which the government could otherwise expect to obtain from his proposed scheme. He therefore sought the agreement of the Chief Secretary Treasury to the whole of the proposed sum being met out of the reserve. Now, again, obviously these are John Moore's words rather than yours, but the reference there to the credit which the government could otherwise expect to obtain might be said to be looking at the government's reputation. Is that your reading of it? Is there another way in which one could understand the reference to credit?
Well, I don't know what John would have had in mind. But it certainly could be read that way if one wished to look at it in that particular way. I can only say that that wasn't my impression from the discussions I had had with John Moore or with Tony Newton.
So, again, is it possible that's a little like the reference to political sustainability? That's potentially an argument being used to win round others? Well,
it's possible. I mean, it isn't my letter. It isn't my phraseology, so I really am not in a position to answer that. I can only answer for what happened.
If we go over to the next page, we can see your contribution to the meeting is in the second paragraph. The Chief Secretary Treasury said that he believed that there was a very strong case for the government providing financial assistance for haemophiliacs with the HIV virus, and it was important that the scheme should be established with the minimum delay. However, it was vital that the proposed scheme should be ring-fenced as tightly as possible in order to minimise the risk of encouraging claims from other groups which the government might find difficult to resist. He wished to discuss with the Social Services Secretary whether part of the cost could be met from the centrally financed services programme, but if this did not prove feasible, he would be content for the entire cost to be met from the reserve. And I think, as it happens, this payment was met from the reserve.
To the best of my recollection, it was.
The concern that the scheme should be ring-fenced as tightly as possible, and the term ring-fencing will come up again and again as we look at later decisions. Why was that something seen, it would appear from this, as so important by you?
Oh, simply because it's expenditure control. the more we spend money, the more we put up taxes or we borrow. That's the point I made earlier. That is always the case. So that would be a standard position with almost anything, that you need, if you face something that was unforeseen, you will try and ring fence it to people who really need the help and not open a new door for other people in other circumstances to seek a similar scheme. And of course, the government were very worried about the fact that they were breaking new ground. It was the first time that any government had actually made absolutely ex gratia payments for where there was no legal fault. That had not happened before, so it was a new situation. And nobody was quite sure how it would work out, so we needed to ring fence it to avoid suddenly opening the option for a whole range of other claims to be made on wholly unrelated issues.
If we then just pick up the discussion, if we go a little further down this page, please, Lawrence. In discussion, the following main points were made. The first is then about the administration of the scheme. I don't need to ask you about that, Sir John. If we go to the next page, just want to read out paragraphs B and C and go back to this issue of government credit. So B says the Hemophilia Society were at present lobbying for the introduction of a special form of benefit which would cost the Exchequer around 60 million per annum. The Social Services Secretary should arrange for informal soundings to be taken of the Society to confirm so far as possible that they would regard the proposed grant as a reasonable sum. The government might not secure any credit at all if the Society were to dismiss the proposed grant as wholly insufficient. C, there was a strong case for the whole of the proposed grant being met from the contingency reserve. The government would lose a great deal of the credit they might otherwise expect to secure if the fund were to be established at the visible expense of other sensitive parts of the health service. So again, we see this reference coming, it would appear from other members of the committee in the discussion, to the government getting credit for making this ex gratia payment available. Are you able to help us understand, as a member of the committee, why we see that being featured as an issue?
I don't remember any discussion about that at this distance in time, and nor I think would anyone reasonably expect me to do so. And I think there are various things. There is a whole range of different ways one might have said that. It wouldn't have been my phraseology, because I don't think that was the primary concern of ministers.
Do you recall whether there were, and I entirely understand the difficulties of recalling specific meetings so long after the event, but do you recall more generally whether there were particular members of the government who were more resistant to the idea of breaking with this long-established policy than others, and who might need to be persuaded that there was an advantage to the government in political or popularity terms?
Well, there were fiscal hawks in the government, quite a few of them. Whether they were on that particular committee or not, I don't think in some cases they were, but it would probably have gone to cabinet in some form.
It did.
So there would have been concern about that, and so there were people who would have been quite hawkish about it. But that wouldn't have been a majority, but there would have been a minority who would have needed to be persuaded. I mean, some of them might have had within their own responsibilities different groups who could fasten on the fact that an ex gratia payment had been made for something. And if ex gratia payment could be made to the health department for this particular cause, why should not an ex gratia payment be made in their department for a group that were giving them reason to be concerned as well? So that is what I think is being protected there.
So that we don't need to come back to this document again, I'm just going to pick up a couple of references to the position of non-haemophiliacs who'd been infected with HIV through blood transfusions or transplant. So we can see at D, it says it was estimated that about 10 to 20 non-haemophiliacs had been infected by HIV as a result of blood transfusions and other transplants. There was a strong case in fairness for extending the scope of the proposed scheme to cover these people, and also perhaps those who'd otherwise been infected by HIV in the course of their medical treatment. And that, on the other hand, such persons did not suffer from the full range of disadvantages of haemophilia with the HIV virus, and there's a continuation, further explanation in that regard. And then if we go over the page, we see the Lord President of the Council summing up the discussion. I'm not going to read it all aloud, but about 12 lines down, there's a sentence beginning, "The subcommittee recognised that certain other groups had a very strong claim to be included in the scheme, but they agreed that the primary consideration should be that the scheme should be tightly ring-fenced. The Social Services Secretary, in consultation with the Chief Secretary Treasury, should consider whether, if the proposed scheme were to be extended to other groups, such as non-haemophiliacs, it could be ring-fenced to them alone." And then there's a suggestion that further work should be undertaken very quickly. As I say, I'm drawing attention to that because we'll come on to the decision-making in relation to non-haemophiliacs later. And then if we could go just a little further down, please, Lawrence. This is still in the Lord President's summary. It's the last few lines. It says, "On the question of funding, the subcommittee had noted the strong presentational advantages of shielding the health service from offsetting savings, but the next step must be for the Social Services Secretary to consult urgently with the Chief Secretary Treasury as he'd requested." Now, that reference to strong presentational advantages, is that about not making cuts from the health budget,
Yes.
but using the contingency reserve?
Exactly. That's exactly what it means.
So that's the Cabinet Subcommittee on AIDS, 10th of November 1987. For the sake of completeness, I'll just read again into the transcript. The discussion was reported by the Lord President to the Prime Minister on the 11th of November, DHSC 0002375_032. We don't need to put that up, Lawrence. And then the Cabinet met, and I will just show this for completeness, CABO 0000185. On the 12th of November, we can pick it up at page 5. Bottom of the page, so it's the last paragraph, we can zoom in on that. So we can see Mr. Moore refers to the subcommittee HA's discussion earlier in the week, and then picking it up 5 lines down, he had now completed the consultations that HA had invited him to carry out with the Chief Secretary Treasury. Preliminary discussions with the Hemophilia Society of Great Britain had also been carried out as HA had requested. The Hemophilia Society were thus aware that the government would assist them in the administration of the financial assistance being made available. And then there's reference to a meeting later in the day of leading figures in the society. Picking it up a few lines further down, if, as he expected, the society's support was forthcoming, he proposed to announce the financial assistance on the following Monday. He would naturally make clear, in accordance with the advice the Solicitor General had given HA, that the money was being made available ex gratia and that the government expressly disclaimed any liability for the haemophilia patient's infection. And whatever the nature of the discussions that you and John Moore had over the preceding 48 hours or so, is this right? The upshot was that this payment of £10 million would be made entirely from the reserves, and it would be limited to haemophiliacs. So there was no extension at that point in time to non-haemophiliacs infected with HIV.
No, we knew the position of non-haemophiliacs were coming to face us. That was self-evident. The purpose of ring fencing is twofold. It's ring fencing to make sure that nobody else creeps into that and starts taking some of the money away from it. So that, to take a practical example, if you then moved on to other people who suffered from tissue transfer, they wouldn't be within that ring fencing. They would have to be dealt with separately and outside the money put aside for the haemophiliacs on that occasion. So the ring fencing isn't just a budgetary measure to protect the Treasury. It's to protect the money that has been voted for a specific purpose to be used only for that specific purpose.
And then if we can just pick up your statement, it's WITN 5284001, please, Lawrence. If we pick it up at the bottom of page 9, we can see in paragraph 3.18 of your statement, you referred to the Cabinet Subcommittee meeting and the Cabinet meeting that we've looked at. At paragraph 3.19, you've set out your position, as we saw reflected in the subcommittee minutes. Then just over the page, just wanted to ask you about what you say in paragraph 320. There were risks. The Hemophilia Society were lobbying for a new benefit, cost 60 million a year, and others now in the future might ask for similar support, and once a policy was broken, it would be difficult to hold the line against other claims. So risks to whom? Risks to government spending, essentially?
Risks to government spending from other completely unrelated claims once we had broken the dam of not paying out for no legal fault compensation. Once we moved to an ex gratia payment, we had opened up potentially a whole range of other options where people may come to the government or sue the government or whatever in terms of getting compensation for something wholly unrelated to health, as well as conceivably related to other aspects of health. That's what it's about.
Now,
it's the same argument about no legal fault compensation.
In terms of the sum that was paid, the £10 million, we saw the reference in Tony Newton's letter to the kind of figures that they had in mind, and then by the time we get to the Cabinet Subcommittee meeting, £10 million is the sum fixed on by John Moore. Do you have any understanding from consideration of the documents or recollection or your general knowledge of how government worked as to how that figure might have been arrived at?
I wasn't involved in arriving at that figure, but I think it would have been arrived at on the basis of conversations between Treasury officials and the Hemophilia Society and the assessment of Treasury officials of what the likely need was going to be. And they wouldn't have undercut it because they would have then had to have gone back again and asked for more money at a later stage. And that's always a more difficult proposition. So they would have made what they thought was a genuine assessment of what the need looked like at that particular time on that particular issue. And it would almost certainly, I don't know this for certain, but it would almost certainly have related to discussions senior officials like Straw and Heppel would have had with the Hemophilia Society, and then discussed and costed within the Health Department. It would not have been costed by the Treasury, it would have been costed by the Health Department.
So you would have expected there to be, but you would not yourself necessarily have been party to, some kind of informed assessment to come up with that figure?
I would have certainly would have expected that. I think it would have been very imprudent of the Health Department to go to a Cabinet Subcommittee or even the Chief Secretary without an assessment of how the money was going to be used.
It might be said, it might be submitted in due course to the Chair, that this was a token sum and it really represented the least the government could get away with paying at that time. Would that be a fair or unfair comment?
Well, I don't think it would be a fair comment. I mean, perspectives, other people would have a perspective. 10 million doesn't sound very much money today, does it? It was a considerably greater sum of money in the late 1980s. And I don't think anyone thought that was going to be the end if the awful problems began to become more apparent and larger.
So I know the time, and I'm going to move next to Sir John's time as Chancellor, so perhaps a good time for the morning break.
Just one question for you before we break. And it's this. To your knowledge, does the inquiry have any document which shows any process which might be described as informed assessment?
I hate it when you ask me that, sir. I'm going to have to duck the question and check. I don't think it does, but I don't pretend to have looked at all the documents that show how the £10 million came up
Well,
with. Not an informed assessment, certainly, but there might how 10 million was alighted upon, we'll need to check.
Well, the informed assessment was what Sir John has just said. He would have expected it would have been imprudent of government not to have done that in some form or other. And that's why I asked.
Yes, well, we'll check, but I'm not aware of anything that would look like an assessment of need.
Thank you. Let me say to you what I say to every witness at the first break, if not before. At this break, and indeed at every break, please remember you are under oath. You must not discuss the evidence you have given, or for that matter, any evidence you think you may yet be asked to give with anyone, whoever that anyone happens to be, but you can talk about anything else you like. We'll take a break now until 10 to 12. 10 to 12.